Hey everyone, welcome back to Killer Bites, a web series where we dish on the craziest true crime cases out there. In today's episode, I'm going to fill you in on the Australian criminal nicknamed Mr. Cruel. Between the late 80s and early 90s, the mysterious Mr. Cruel broke into several homes in Melbourne, Australia. In his third sting, he abducted a teenage girl who was found lifeless a year later. Mr. Cruel was super sneaky and made sure to cover up his tracks. Over 30 years later, the identity of Mr. Cruel remains unknown. Mr. Cruel's first break-in took place in the early morning hours of August 22nd, 1987. He targeted the home of a family who lived in the quaint city of Lower Plenty, which was in the suburbs of Melbourne. Mr. Cruel broke in through the living room window and made his way upstairs. He was wearing a black ski mask and was armed with a firearm and a blade. He did not come to play. Mr. Cruel woke up the parents and first pretended like this was a typical robbery simply for money and possessions. Threatening them with a weapon, Mr. Cruel demanded the couple get on their stomachs. He then tied up their hands and feet, blindfolded and gagged them with surgical tape, and locked them in the closet. After that, Mr. Cruel went into the 6-year-old little boy's room. Just like his parents, the boy was blindfolded and gagged with surgical tape. And then Mr. Cruel tied him up to his bed. Once he was done with that, Mr. Cruel went into the 11-year-old daughter's room. Over the next 2 hours, he went back and forth from forcing himself on the preteen and rummaging through the house. At one point, he even stopped to make some food to eat. Once Mr. Cruel was satisfied, he took a jacket and a box of records from the family's house, cut the telephone cords, and skedaddled. The police were notified of the incident and word began to spread. This attack really spooked everyone in Lower Plenty, and the worst part is that the cops were unable to identify the perpetrator. They did not know what his face looked like because he was wearing a mask, but they did know Mr. Cruel had some sort of nautical experience because the knots he used to tie up the parents and son were used by sailors. When investigators questioned the daughter, she told them Mr. Cruel had used the phone during one of his breaks from harming her. The call seemed pretty serious too. The daughter heard Mr. Cruel tell the person on the other end of the phone, who he called Bozo, to move their children or they would be next. I'm guessing he meant he'd attack them next. It's pretty confusing, but it got even more confusing when the cops checked the phone records of the family phone Mr. Cruel allegedly used, because there was no record of this phone call. So either the girl is lying or Mr. Cruel monologued this fake phone call to confuse the family and cops. I'm thinking it's the second one, and as for the motive, that remained a mystery as well. This family had no real reason to be targeted like this, so it really seemed like it was a random attack. So the community tried to go back to normal life, hoping this was just a one-time incident. But a little over a year later, Mr. Cruel struck again. On December 27th, 1988, he broke into the home of the Wills family, which consisted of the dad, John, his wife, and their 4 kids. They lived in Ringwood, which is about 20 minutes away from Lower Plenty. Just like his last sting, Mr. Cruel broke in and woke up the parents. The way he did it was terrifying too. Not that there's an unterrifying way for an intruder to wake a victim up. He held a firearm up to John Will's head and said, "Don't be a hero." Once John and his wife woke up, Mr. Cruel commanded them to lay on their stomachs. Being threatened with a firearm and blade, they complied. Mr. Cruel then gagged them with medical tape and tied them up using sophisticated sailor knots just like before. He told the couple he only wanted their money, but that was a lie. After he snatched up $35 from their nightstand, Mr. Cruel searched their house for all their phones and cut the cords. Then he went into the bedroom of the 4 daughters. Mr. Cruel went up to a 10-year-old Sharon, who was the oldest, and woke her up. He called her by name, which means he did his research on his targets. Mr. Cruel blindfolded and gagged Sharon, grabbed some of her clothes, and took her with him as he left the home. So this wasn't just a break-in and assault, this was an abduction. About 15 minutes later, John and his wife managed to break free from the rope and tape. They went straight to their daughter's room and discovered Sharon was missing. John went to call the police, but he couldn't do that from his house because the phone lines were cut. So he ran over to his neighbor's house to make the call. The cops came out to investigate and the search for Sharon began. Much later that evening, Sharon was located. Thankfully, she was still alive and healthy, but extremely traumatized, of course. After Mr. Cruel abducted Sharon, he took her somewhere unknown and gave her a glass of milk, lemonade, and a Vegemite sandwich. Then Mr. Cruel removed Sharon's clothes, bathed her, trimmed her nails, and brushed and flossed her teeth, presumably to remove any DNA evidence he might have left on Sharon. He discarded her clothing and dressed her in trash bags. After that, Mr. Cruel dropped Sharon off at the high school a few miles away from her family's house. And then sometime after midnight, a woman saw Sharon standing on the corner. The brave woman decided to approach Sharon. Anyway, the woman went up to Sharon, who told her, "My name is Sharon Wills, and I was taken from home early this morning, a man left me here and told me to go and ring home. The woman called the police and helped reunite Sharon with her family. Investigators chatted with Sharon and tried to gather as many details about Mr. Cruel as they could. Sharon was blindfolded the whole time, so she wasn't able to describe his appearance. Strangely, Sharon did say that Mr. Cruel was very soft-spoken, straightforward, and, believe it or not, caring and gentle. Maybe because he kept her alive and fed her a Vegemite sandwich, but maybe she meant caring in comparison to other predators. The only information the cops knew was that Mr. Cruel was wearing a dark ski mask and blue overalls. Based on the striking similarities between this attack and the one that happened a year prior, detectives theorized the perp was the same person. At this point, they nicknamed him the Hampton Rapist, but he later became known as Mr. Cruel. Following their attack, the Wills family was terrified this man might go after them again. So they set up a security system, got a dog, and at night the entire family of 6 all slept in a common room together. After the fact, John had a lot of guilt for not stepping in and protecting his daughter. He played the age-old what-if game, but he was all tied up, so there was truly nothing he could do. The Wills weren't the only ones freaking out. Families all over the Melbourne area were terrified Mr. Cruel would target them next. And for the Linus family, their greatest fears became a reality. On the evening of July 3rd of 1990, Mr. Cruel broke into the Linus' rental home. The parents, Brian and Rosemary, were out at a party, so their 2 daughters, 15-year-old Fiona and 13-year-old Nicola, were home alone. When Mr. Cruel got inside, he woke up both girls with his classic pistol and blade combo. Mr. Cruel demanded Nicola to go and grab her school uniform while he tied up Fiona in her bed. He told Fiona that he was going to take Nicola, and the only way they could get her back is if their dad, Brian, paid him $25,000. After that, he left Fiona tied up, grabbed Nicola, loaded her up in the Linus' rental car, and drove off. He didn't go far in the rental car though, probably because he would be traceable in it. Instead, he drove the rental car about half a mile, parked, and forced Nicola into another car. Not long after that, Brian and Rosemary made it home from the party. When they arrived, they noticed their car was missing and the front door was open. They carefully entered and they discovered Fiona all tied up in bed. She told them about what happened and relayed the message about the ransom. Brian and Rosemary were in complete shock. They called the police and a search began. There was no incriminating evidence left behind, and the investigators could tell the perp was quick and smart. A little over a day later, a press conference was held where Brian gave a statement begging for the safe return of his daughter. He even agreed to give the perp the ransom money. Mr. Cruel didn't give any instructions on how to deliver the money to him. And after the press conference aired, there was still not a peep from Mr. Cruel. It's like he didn't even want the ransom money. Like he wasn't even planning on receiving it, and he just said that to Fiona to throw off the investigation. About 2 days after the incident, Nicola was found alive. She was dropped off by some power plant in the middle of the night. Unlike Sharon, Nicola was still fully clothed with a blanket wrapped around her. And when Mr. Cruel dumped her, he told Nicola to lay down on the ground until she heard him drive off. After that, she got up, removed her blindfold, and went to get help. She made it to someone's house who graciously let her use their phone at 2 a.m. Nicola called her dad and he rushed to pick her up. What a relief for him. This day just so happened to be Nicola's birthday too. I mean, talk about a traumatizing and memorable birthday. At first, the police thought this perp was out to get Brian because of the nature of the ransom demand. Maybe there was someone he worked with who was out to get him, but once Nicola gave more details about her abduction and the man who carried it out, they knew this was Mr. Cruel's doing. Again, she didn't see what his face looked like because he was wearing a staple ski mask, but she did see that he had reddish brown hair and stood at about 5 feet 8 inches tall. Nicola also said there were moments when her blindfold was off, so she gave them some information about Mr. Cruel's house and car, which they knew nothing about until this point. Nicola was bathed and cleaned like Sharon, but unfortunately, she was also physically abused. During her time at his house, Nicola was restrained to Mr. Cruel's bed with this neck brace contraption that held her down as he forced himself on her. Nicola also said that she heard him talking occasionally like it was to someone else, but she never heard anyone else's voice. She thought maybe he was working with someone, but the police theorized this was another attempt to throw off the investigation. Even with this new information, the investigators were still unable to arrest Mr. Cruel, let alone find out his true identity. His last known attack took place on April 13th, 1991. John and Phyllis Chan were out working and their 3 kids were home alone. phone. This wasn't a big deal because their oldest child, Carmen, was 13, so she was in charge. But much to their dismay, that's when Mr. Cruel would pounce. Officials theorized Mr. Cruel stalked his victims for several weeks before attacking, so he could get a feel for their schedule and know when the best time to break in would be. So back to this incident. Carmen and her younger sister went to the kitchen to get some food when out pops a scary man in a mask saying, "I only want your money." Look, he said that several times now. We know it's not true. He made the two younger kids go into Carmen's closet and shoved the bed in front of the door to make sure they couldn't escape. But a few minutes later, they actually managed to get out. They rushed to the phone to call their dad. By this point, Mr. Cruel had already left with Carmen through the sliding glass door in the kitchen. He took her to an empty lot nearby, forced her into a car, and drove off. When the cops arrived at the Chan's home, they knew that this was Mr. Cruel's doing, as it matched his MO, targeting a family in a safe, wealthy neighborhood, breaking in through a window, tying up victims, leaving no incriminating evidence behind, and abducting a teenage girl. He also wrote, "Payback, Asian drug dealer, more to come," on the back of Phyllis's car. Although this was pursued as a lead and the Chans were investigated, the cops assumed this was Mr. Cruel doing what he does best, throwing the authorities off. Unlike Mr. Cruel's previous abductions, Carmen was never found alive. A press conference was held, a cipher was published in the newspaper that Carmen would have been able to understand, and $300,000 in ransom money was offered. But still, no Carmen. About a year later, a man was walking his dog along a creek when he discovered Carmen's skeleton. An autopsy was performed where examiners determined Carmen had been deceased for about a year. She had 3 bullet wounds to the head. It's crazy because the Chans had more hope than most families of abducted children solely based on Mr. Cruel's pattern. But for whatever reason, he decided to end Carmen's life. Phyllis later mentioned that Carmen was very strong and stubborn. If Mr. Cruel tried to force himself on her, she would have definitely fought back. And maybe that angered Mr. Cruel to the point of executing her. This incident was traumatizing for the Chans in many ways. Not only did they lose their daughter, but John was put under a lot of fire because of the note written on the back of his wife's car. He was then hardcore investigated, but has since been cleared of any wrongdoings. And the authorities knew they had to put more effort into finding Mr. Cruel. They organized a huge search for him, nicknamed Operation Spectrum. Millions of dollars were put into this investigation, which went on for years. In 1994, Operation Spectrum was put to a halt. And as of now, we still don't know where Mr. Cruel is. I mean, I really hope that he's passed away or is in prison or something else, because this man is horrifying. Who is he? I mean, why would he commit such horrible crimes? And why didn't he spare Carmen's life? The world may never know, but tell me your theories in the comments below, and I'll see you next time on Killer Bites. Stay safe out there.